Welcome to Mr. Hutchings' History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so get ready to maybe feel some historical chills. We're diving into some seriously tense Cold War vibes today.
Yeah, and forget about those casual wish-you-were-here telegrams. We're talking top-secret diplomatic dispatches, thousands of words, laying bare just how broken the U.S.-Soviet relationship had become.
It's 1946, right? They were allies just a year before, wrapping up World War II, and suddenly, bam! It's like a war of words erupting between them.
Think of it less like Dear John letters, more like each side writing down every fear they had about the other, and these letters had real consequences.
High stakes, for sure. So that's our focus today, a deep dive into the long telegram and the Novikov telegram. Because these documents didn't just express anxieties, they shaped policy for decades.
Shaped policy, fueled paranoia. Honestly, you could say they practically wrote the playbook for the Cold War as we know it.
Okay, so paint the picture for us. 1946, Europe's barely breathing after the war.
Total mess. Germany in pieces, the Nazis are done, but now there's this power vacuum you could drive a tank through.
And of course, both the U.S. and the Soviets are trying to, park in that vacuum.
Each with a very different vision for what the New World Order should look like. On one hand, you've got the U.S., all about capitalist democracy. On the other, the Soviet Union, a communist state solely focused on solidifying its power.
Recipe for an awkward second date after the whole defeating the Nazis thing, to say the least.
You can almost feel that metaphorical Iron Curtain starting to descend across Europe. And right smack in the middle of it all are two telegrams.
Like each side yelling their side of the story, hoping someone's listening.
And hoping that yelling doesn't turn into something worse. But first, let's rewind a bit. Let's talk about George Kennan and his infamous long telegram, because this is where it all begins.
Yes, the long telegram. That's not just a clever name, is it?
Oh, no. Picture this. You're at the U.S. State Department, 1946, still sorting through the aftermath of the war, and this massive 8,000-word telegram lands on your desk, straight from Moscow.
8,000. That's not a telegram, that's a short novel?
And trust me, it reads like a thriller, too. See, Kennan wasn't just some random diplomat. He was the expert on the Soviet Union. He'd spent years there, spoke the language, understood the system inside and out.
So he sends this massive cable. What's the gist? Guys, you need to pay attention to what the Soviets are up to.
Basically, yeah, but with way more nuance. He's sending up a huge warning flare saying, look, these guys, they're not just driven by communist ideology, they're deeply, deeply insecure.
Insecure?
Like existentially insecure. They see the West, meaning us, as this fundamental threat, this capitalist monster that's out to destroy them.
Okay, so not just about spreading communism, it's about survival, at least in their minds.
Exactly. And this is where things get interesting. Kennan argues that the Soviets, they're trapped in this zero-sum worldview. They can't even comprehend a world where the U.S. and the Soviet Union both exist, let alone cooperate.
One of them has to go, kind of thing.
Essentially, yeah. And they were absolutely sure it wouldn't be them.
Yikes. I'm starting to see where the whole Cold War paranoia starts to take root.
And it gets even more intense. Because Kennan, he doesn't just diagnose the problem, he proposes a solution. And that solution is containment.
Containment. So what does that look like in practice? Like build a wall around the Soviet Union.
Not literally a wall, at least not yet. But Kennan argued that appealing to Soviet reason, it just wouldn't work. They only responded to one thing, force.
Oh boy, here we go.
His telegram, it basically urged the U.S. to adopt this policy of actively containing Soviet expansion, like drawing a line in the sand and saying, this far, no further.
So this containment idea, that's the seed that grows into the whole Cold War shebang, domino theory, proxy wars, the works.
You could definitely say that. Kennan's long telegram, it didn't just land on desks, it landed in the minds of U.S. policymakers. It helped solidify the Truman Doctrine, which basically said the U.S. would back any nation resisting communist pressure.
One telegram from one diplomat sets the stage for like half a century of global tension. Yeah. That's wild.
It really shows you the power of ideas, especially when they're presented with such clarity at such a pivotal time. But here's the thing. We've only heard one side of the story. And the Soviets, they weren't just sitting back listening to Kennan's analysis.
They had their own fears, their own perspective, their own telegram headed right back at us.
Right, so buckle up. Enter Nikolai Novikov, Soviet ambassador to the U.S. Just a few months after that long telegram, he fires off a cable of his own.
Back to Moscow, I'm guessing?
Straight to the top Stalin himself.
Oof, talk about pressure. What do you even say to Stalin in the middle of all this? Dear Joseph, hope things are good in Moscow, by the way.
Pretty much sums it up. But what makes Novikov telegram so fascinating is that it's almost like Kennan's evil twin. See, Novikov, he argues that the U.S., they weren't interested in peace. In cooperation, they were playing for keeps, aiming for global domination.
So from the Soviet view, it was the U.S. throwing its weight around, not the other way around.
100%. Novikov's warning was stark. The U.S. was using its economic clout to strong-arm other countries, building up its military like crazy, and, get this, encircling the Soviet Union with military bases.
Like, he predicted those Cold War maps with all the arrows pointing at Moscow years before anyone even drew them up.
He saw the writing on the wall, absolutely. Novikov argued that the U.S., they weren't trying to build a stable world, they were exploiting the chaos left after the war.
And let's not forget, this is right after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? The Soviets had to be a little on edge about U.S. intentions after that.
You think? The atomic bomb, it changed everything. Novikov's telegram, it tapped into this deep-seated fear in the Soviet leadership, the fear that the U.S., riding high on its victory in World War II, that it was the new top dog, and it would crush anyone who got in its way.
It's like both sides are reading from the same history books but coming to wildly different conclusions.
And that's the tragedy of this whole era, isn't it? You've got these brilliant minds, Kennan and Novikov, both observing the same events, both drawing on their expertise, but their interpretations are worlds apart.
Like staring at one of those optical illusions. What you see depends on, well, on where you already are.
Exactly. Both telegrams, they have kernels of truth in them, sure, but they're also distorted by the biases and the anxieties of the nations they represent. The U.S. saw a communist threat behind every corner, and the Soviets were convinced the capitalists were closing in.
No wonder they ended up on a collision course.
It's almost inevitable when you think about it. So we've got these two bombshell telegrams. They land in their respective capitals. What happens next?
I mean, they didn't just file those things away and go about their day, right? How did these telegrams actually change the course of events? So these telegrams, they weren't just ignored, right? I mean, they had to have some serious ripple effects.
Oh, absolutely. Kennan's long telegram, that thing was basically gospel in Washington, circulated through the highest levels, really cemented this idea that the Soviets, they were not to be trusted, that containing them had to be the top priority.
And that led to?
Well, you name it, increased military spending, the creation of NATO, even U.S. involvement in Korea and Vietnam, all part of that domino theory, stopping communism from spreading whatever the cost.
Wow, talk about a long shadow.
Yeah.
So Kennan's telegram, that's the U.S. side. What about Novikov's message? Did that land with the same kind of impact?
It did, but in a different way. Remember, Stalin, he was already deeply distrustful of the West. And Novikov's telegram lands right on his desk, confirming his worst suspicions.
Talk about bad timing.
It added fuel to the fire, basically. Deepened that paranoia that was already gripping the Kremlin, led to even tighter control in Eastern Europe. Anyone who disagreed with Stalin got silenced. And the Soviets, they basically walled themselves off behind that Iron Curtain.
So you had these two countries, each convinced that the other is out to get them, both acting on those fears and, in a way, making those fears come true. Talk about a vicious cycle.
A classic self-fulfilling prophecy. And the tragedy is, both sides, they probably could have pulled back, maybe found some common ground. But that suspicion, that fundamental distrust, it was like this huge roadblock. They were locked into that Cold War standoff, driven by the fear that was laid out in those two telegrams.
It's kind of, well, disheartening, you know? Makes you feel like history is this runaway train and we're just along for the ride.
Well, that's the question, isn't it? How much power do individuals really have to shape history?
Exactly. We're talking about two documents here, written by two people, however influential they might have been.
Historians have been debating that for centuries, honestly. And the truth is, it's never simple. People make choices, they write those memos, offer theories. But those choices, they're also shaped by larger forces, ideologies, economics, political realities. It's this constant push and pull between what individuals do and the currents of history itself.
Wow. That makes you wonder about, well, about today, right? Are there telegrams being written right now, shaping the future in ways we can't even grasp?
That's the million-dollar question, and honestly, it's one we should all be asking. The world's facing some seriously complex challenges right now. Conflicts, climate change, technology changing faster than we can keep up. And the way we frame those challenges, the assumptions we bring to the table, those will determine how we respond, what choices we make.
So what you're saying is the real lesson here, it's not just about Cold War history, right? It's about critical thinking, about challenging our own biases, trying to understand where other people are coming from, even when, especially when we disagree.
Exactly. We need to get out of our own echo chambers, really engage with different viewpoints. Because in a world that's just flooded with information, being able to sift through it all, to question what we see and hear that's more important than ever, there's always more to the story.
That's a great note to end on. And to all of you listening, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the telegrams that ignited the Cold War. It's a reminder that history, it's not just some dusty old textbook subject. It's alive, it's relevant, and the choices we make today, well, they might just echo into the future.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings' History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.